This is the Health, Wealth, and Performance Podcast, and I'm the host, John Cartwright. In today's episode, what we're going to look at is first principles thinking. And first principles thinking kind of has become popular again because of the likes of people like Elon Musk, sort of making it popular again and talking about how he goes about solving problems. But if you actually kind of look online now, you'll see a bunch of sort of modern day entrepreneurs talking about this first principles thinking. And why I think it's valuable to have a chat about it is that when you're solving problems through first principles thinking, it sounds weird to say that problems can become fun, but it really is that problems can become fun. And the reason being is that you end up sort of becoming a creator, where you tap into the creative process as you go about sort of trying to solve problems. And you can put it into any aspect of life. In modern times, it's kind of been linked to business, but you can actually link it to anything that you're trying to achieve. For me, I started linking it to trying to help clients and then trying to help people with their performance. Because when you really boil things down to their basics, the answers can become kind of simple. But because you're boiling things down to a basic level, you can actually create something new, which is the beauty of first principles thinking. So for yourself, what I hope you get out of today is sort of a way that you can start to implement this into your own life. When you come up against a problem or a challenge or something that you're trying to do at the moment, how could you go about breaking it down and thinking it from a first principles thinking perspective and then try and create something new? So sometimes it's hard to explain what first principles is. I mean, people speak about first principles as if it's a new thing, but really it's over 2,000 years old. It goes back to Aristotle. And Aristotle was, kind of quoted as saying, the first basis from which a thing is known. That's essentially what first principles is. But when you kind of look at it, you say, what does that mean? So I like to think of things in analogies. And the analogy that I think of with first principles thinking is when you use the example of a chef versus a cook. If you look at a chef and you hand a chef a set of ingredients, they can look at all the independent ingredients, have a look at what the properties are of those ingredients, and then actually look at those properties and the principles of those ingredients, and then think about, hey, I can create something totally new. And that's versus a cook who would look at those ingredients and say, oh, I've cooked something like that before. I can put these ingredients together. I sort of know a recipe for this. I sort of know a recipe for these ingredients. So, the chef and the cook could come up with a delicious meal, but only one of them is going to be original, and only one of them is going to come up with a new creation, and that's the chef. So what I'm inviting you to do is to take on this first principles thinking and start thinking about becoming a chef in your life in terms of how you're going about your problems rather than a cook. Rather than a cook and going back into the past and going, let me do the same thing over and over again in terms of trying to solve my problems, and start becoming a chef and break things down and say, all right, what am I actually dealing with here? And how can I go about fixing this or sorting this out or solving this problem? So we're going to go over the 3 steps of how you can go about implementing this into your own life. And this is exactly the 3 steps that people like Elon Musk use when they're trying to solve their problems. It's the same way you can apply these steps to your own life. So step 1 is to identify and define your current assumptions. So when you're looking at your problem, can you actually get present to the assumptions that you have around the problem itself? So when you do that, what happens is you get just a little bit of a glimpse into the way your brain thinks. For a second, you become the observer of your own brain, and to see how much there's sort of these autopilots that are running about any given situation. And just by writing them down and saying, identifying and defining them, these assumptions, what it does is it kind of almost, I sort of picture it as being like this painting that's sort of already muddled up. There's paint all over it. And to an extent, you're kind of swiping the paint aside. So you've got this blank canvas to work with again. And so that's step 1. Step 2 is to break down the problem into its fundamental principles. So similar to kind of the chef analogy, what you're thinking of is if I break things down into what are the ingredients that I've got here, what am I actually working with, and what's the basic principles of, in that case, being like, what's the basic principles of this, say it's meat or it's a vegetable or it's a sort, it's an oil of some description. It's being able to say like, what am I actually working with here? I'll give you an example of how I did this with a client of mine later on, so you can kind of see how I put this all together. But for now, step 2 is break down the problem into its fundamental principles. Step 3 is to create new solutions from scratch. And this is where you become the creator. Now you've sort of got that blank canvas. You've got everything there. You got your paints and everything that you're ready to roll with. You got the tools. Now it's time to create something new. This is where that the fun can come into this problem solving and the ability to create something new. Now, the power of first principles thinking will only become apparent when you start to use it, when you actually start to do it. But as you start kind of researching this more for yourself and you learn about it and you try it for yourself, then you'll sort of watch the evidence for sort of why it works almost everywhere. And an example I'll give you is that, say in research and development areas or in medical fields, quite often the breakthrough in technology or the breakthrough in treatments, there's some good research on, in particular, research and development, that a lot of the time the new ideas for an industry actually come from outside of the industry. And so the reason being is it's exactly what we're talking about with those steps, is that, people don't have these assumptions when they come into a new field or into a new area. They just look at the problem for what it is. And so just that alone gives you an insight into just how much you get into this habitual way of thinking about things, and you become quite sort of blinded by the way you look at things. And if you can think about that from a research and development perspective and saying, right, the experts in the field don't come up with the new technology, it's someone from outside of it. That should be enough to kind of take this pretty seriously, because that means that your potential, if you like, your potential for how you solve problems and the results that you can get, it seems like external factors might be the thing that's in your way, but it's actually you that's in the way. That's how you can see that your assumptions that you put on things when you're trying to solve problems, be that in your work, be that in your business, be that in your relationships, be that in your sports performance. It's the things that you think are real. That's the things that get you into trouble. Mark Twain has a famous quote. I think it goes along the lines of, it ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's the things that you know for sure that just ain't so. And I could almost just do another whole podcast on just that quote alone, because the levels of that thinking is exactly what we're talking about here with first principles. If you can, to an extent, strip away a lot of the things that you think you know about something and start from fresh, you'll start to have much better results. You'll start to have results that other people can't get, because quite often when you're in an industry or you're in an area of expertise, no one comes up with anything new. They just regurgitate the same rubbish over and over and over again. So, in my own personal experience of putting this into practice in terms of helping people to get results, I give an example of one person that reached out to me. She came to see me as a client, as a patient for an injury, and she wanted to become world champion in her sport. Now, her sport was karate, and I didn't know anything about it. So it was great to an extent, because I had some assumptions about karate, but as I put my assumptions aside, I started to have this blank canvas pretty quickly. And so as she came in to see me, she said, look, I want to become world champion in my sport. And immediately the assumption that I said was like, okay, have you been elite at anything else in the past? Like, have you been an elite athlete? And she said, no, I've been a dancer when I was young. It's like, okay. Then I said, have you played any sports? Like, have you done any combat things in the past? Because my assumption straight away was, oh, she must be fighting if she's doing karate. And to which she said, no, I don't do the striking. I do this thing called kata, which is effectively a set routine that you're sort of performing almost like a dance, but not quite. You're performing for judges, and the judges essentially judge you on your performance versus another competitor. So there's only kind of two of you competing at a time, you versus somebody else. So I was like, okay. So those assumptions, as they started to creep up, I had to try and let go of all these assumptions and say, okay, let me just define all the things that I think I know about karate. And so as I went through karate, I was like, okay, it's all about these positions that they're going to hit, and it's about fighting. Like, it's about pretending that you're striking somebody. And once I started getting rid of those assumptions, I started asking some better questions. And so my questions were, what are you getting judged on? What are the judges actually looking for when they look at you? I asked, like, from a perspective, from her perspective, what are you aware of that you're missing so far? So as we started to build this up, I then asked her to send me some footage of her performing her katas. And as I watched those katas, the things that kind of looking at these katas with not a lot of knowledge of what I'm looking at, I started looking at the things of the fundamental principles, if you like, of that step 2. What am I looking at? What is she trying to do from the list of criteria of what she's judged on? What's her fundamental principles that she's going to need? And so as I was looking at it, I was watching her performance, and I was like, right, she's not using ground forces very effectively with her punches, okay? And so that's just something that I can see because of my experience in over 20 years. But the principles of, does she use the ground to generate her force, wasn't utilizing it well. Then I was looking at her ability to decelerate and accelerate on her movements. And so part of that being the ground forces is how I could see that, but her ability to decelerate was really poor. And so then, as I sort of analyzed all this video and I had where we were going, I also had to look at, how am I going to make these changes? Now, elite athletes are, quite often doing 2 and 3 sessions a day and sort of training 6 or 7 days a week. This was a mother of 3 who had a very successful business that she had hardly any time to actually dedicate to this. So I had to go through, how am I going to get her the results with only really 2 sessions a week? And so I broke down again into the principles of what are we going to need? Well, we're going to need her athletic ability, which she had some pretty good athletic ability because she was actually an elite ballet dancer when she was younger. So the athleticism wasn't too bad. I had to develop that. Then the technical aspect of her skills, I couldn't help her with the technicalities of the kata in terms of her performance of it. But what I could help her with is that her performance and how she executes things in terms of what I could see was missing from the ground reaction forces and then the acceleration and deceleration. And then the other big component that definitely the kind of principles, if I broke it down to, is her mental ability. And as I listened to her story about the struggles that she'd been through, this is a woman who was coming to me in her sort of early 40s, and at the age of 40 was sort of diagnosed with some TIA, some minor strokes, and they couldn't find out what was happening. But essentially it ended up being I won't go into the details too much, but essentially it was something that was becoming life-threatening. And as she went with the specialists, their advice to her was to never do strenuous exercise again. And so for her mentality, she was like, well, I'm going to prove this wrong. So she had her why was pretty strong. She also had a child that had been through major cancer scare and had really been on death's door a couple of times. So this, and talking to her about that story, her ability to keep pushing through things was just unbelievable. Her resolve and positivity and the way that she now looked at the world was just a total lack of fear, total lack of fear of judgment, of failure, all of these aspects. So when I started looking at all of this, I started saying to her, look, I think I can help you. I think I can help you with your goal, which is, to become world champion. So as we started kind of creating this plan, creating this new thing, I had to kind of give up those assumptions that I need all this time. I need time with the athlete. I need all of these, we need to train this amount each week. All of that, I just had to throw it out. So can I get her the results looking at what I've got? And so that's what we set about doing. And I built up a program and started educating her about the things that she was missing. And so we sort of taught her how to use the ground forces. Hopefully that's not kind of like people will follow me when I say that. It's the ability to push against the ground to generate her power and her force. Because she wasn't doing that. She was trying to generate it higher up the chain, like trying to generate it through her torso, as opposed to using the ground to push, to initiate things. And we went back to some of the basics of just think about throwing a punch. How do you throw a punch? Have you thrown a ball? And she was like, oh no, I've never done anything like that. So she didn't even know how to throw a ball. So the throwing a punch didn't make any sense. So when we taught her how to use the ground, how to push against the ground to generate her punches, all of a sudden her punching power and precision went through the roof, to the point where her senseis who had been working with her for, a number of years said, what the heck's happening with your punches? They're so much more crisp and on point. She didn't tell them it was me because she didn't, there was some egos in the way. She didn't want someone who said, knows nothing about karate is helping this person punch better. Doesn't even know, isn't a fighter himself. But it's when you started looking in that, seeing what she was missing, I could come up with this new way of her looking at things. Then her ability to accelerate and decelerate, in particular, we focused on the deceleration because to be able to stop in those movements, she needed to stop at pinpoint accuracy. And it was the slowing down rather than what everyone thinks of. Again, with her sensei, she was getting told to speed up, get faster, faster. And when I was looking at her, I was like, well, no, I don't think it's her ability to speed up. It's the ability to slow down and get precision. Again, after we worked on that for a couple of months with some strengthening and her ability to strengthen certain muscles in her shoulder girdle, as well as through her hips and legs, she was able to stop with precision. Again, the feedback was like, what the heck are you doing? You are just going to level upon level. Then she started getting recognized by people higher up. So long story short, through having a limited time, limited resources, having a fraction of what some of the athletes that she was up against were having access to, she managed to win that world title, which is fantastic. And, I know that I had a huge role in that in terms of solving these problems with first principles thinking. But I also realized that I was still like a piece of the puzzle. There was still a team like her senseis and things that told her some of the technicalities. They helped her significantly. But what's neat is a person that has no experience in karate, no experience in fighting, no history of fighting for myself, can pick up somebody and help them to a world title just by breaking things down into its most simplest form and building up a new solution for this person. That's pretty neat. That's sort of one of many stories that I've got in terms of my experience in applying these first principles to people. But I can, the neat thing for me is I've become somewhat of a generalist in terms of helping people. And this is what you can start to look at too. I've become a generalist because I've started to look at areas in my life, relationships, be it business, be it finances. And when I start to apply these things, all of a sudden my results in all areas of life are improving. And when I get a problem, rather than sort of looking at it like, damn, how am I going to overcome these things? Rather than looking at the world from there's all these external things that are affecting your life, first principles thinking switches it to be you're in the driver's seat, saying instead of me being at the effect of life, how can I affect life? And when you're in that driver's seat, everything starts to shift. You start just looking at the world differently. You start listening a little bit more. I talk a million miles an hour, but it's my ability to listen for the things that other people sometimes are missing now. And so it's, like so many people have talked about, I used to look at the loudest person in the room was being the smartest. And as I started to ask better questions that come across mentors and these high level individuals, I started to realize their ability to listen and to ask better questions is actually the key to going to next levels. And that's exactly what first principles thinking is about. Aristotle, Socrates, all these greatest thinkers were that still have been considered the greatest thinkers, like, over 2,000 years ago. They had better questions and they're looking at things through a different lens. And that is really through first principles thinking. So I definitely have an invitation to you. I hope I feel like I'm on a bit of a sales pitch to you about first principles, but I really am. I think it's, if you can apply first principles to yourself and then you can find other people that are applying first principles, man, it's so dangerous. Like you can go to such a different level, especially if you could get in a whole organization that's thinking through that. Man, like problems that we've had in the world that seem like too hard to solve could be solved so quickly. It's not funny. Like everything politically, the whole lot, but it just takes people applying them for themselves and starting to apply it to what they're doing, and it'll be this thing that grows over time. Is certainly my hope for how this first principles thinking might kind of spread through the world. So my invitation is certainly see if you can take it on for yourself and looking at all areas of your life. Like, and I mean it, all areas, but pick the one that probably seems like you're up against it the most, and see if you can apply these 3 steps. So step number 1 is identify and define your current assumptions about the problem. Number 2 is break down the problem into its fundamental principles. What are you actually dealing with? What actually needs to shift? What actually needs to be achieved? Then step number 3, create new solutions from scratch. See if you can get back to the blank canvas, if you like, and see if you can create something new from there. New solutions, not based on anything that you've known from the past. It's purely looking at the problem and the solution for what it is. I hope that sparks some curiosity into you, and I hope you can kind of, even if you can't quite articulate it, it's ignited something within you to sort of think of, hey, maybe my answers are closer than I think. And it's just a matter of me looking at things a different way rather than being overwhelmed, be like, I don't know how to do first principles. But if you have any questions or comments, please pop them down below. It gives me such an insight into what's been received and also what people are interested in, because essentially I'm on my own journey here trying to put out this education and knowledge that I have, but it's also like can go wherever you want it to go. So that can only happen if you let me know. So until next time, is bye from me.